Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We welcome you to another edition of The Indisputable Truth. The Indisputable Truth is a summer program which is designed to aid and support young Muslims and others in developing themselves in their minds and their thinking with regard to Islam. The reason why it's called Indisputable Truth is because it attempts to help Muslims work through those areas where they may be doubting in, where they may be struggling in, where there may be questions in. It's a program that was designed by myself and Dr. Arif Hussein. And it was designed specifically for the Islamic Learning Foundation. I am Imam Yusuf Rios, the resident scholar of Islamic Learning Foundation, and I welcome you. This installation of the Indisputable Truth breaks up into two courses. One which I will be teaching in, and the second which Sheikh Umar Hasib will be teaching in. And in these two sessions, we're going to be looking at the history and preservation of the Quran and the Sunnah, and we're going to be looking at how it is that we can develop ourselves as Muslims in general, and how it is that we, can have confidence in Islam and understand Islam in a healthy way. In my session, we're going to be dealing with Quran, Sunnah, and reason. We're going to be dealing with the development of our minds as Muslims, building the Muslim mind. And we're going to be dealing with principles to navigate those areas of life which may be unclear, and how to use that which is clear to us to guide us. We're going to be covering a number of chapters of the Quran and a number of Hadith, as well as the history of the Quran and the history of the Sunnah and the history of fiqh. Fiqh means how it is that the scholars were understanding the Quran and the Sunnah, and how it is that our knowledge of the halal and the haram developed. It's important to understand history because it gives us a background. And so we're going to see how it is that the Muslims, they built themselves up as a community, and how it is that they were taught to understand the deen. When we study the history of the Quran, we get an understanding of how it is that the Quran was written, how it is that the Quran was preserved, how it is that the Quran remains the central source of Islam generation after generation. It will allow us to have confidence in the Quran. And not only are we going to talk about how it was that the Quran was preserved as far as its transmission, the contents of the Quran coming to us, but also how it is that the understanding of the Quran is preserved generation after generation. That's why we get into the topic of the Quran, Sunnah, and reason. Because reason has a lot to do with how it is that we understand. So there are forms of reason that are encouraged, and there are forms of reason which can cause us to doubt or cause us to even have mental health issues. So we want to talk about that. Like sometimes when we overthink and we think heavily in a negative way, it could lead us to depression, or it could lead us to doubting ourselves and our abilities, and that can undermine our own health and can lead to other things. When we think logically and systematically, it helps us to be able to plan. It helps us to be able to understand. It gives us a sense that the world is a place where human beings can make a difference. When we use reason in the proper way, it allows us to understand the role that the Quran and the Sunnah play in our lives. When we use reason in the improper way, it doesn't allow us to see beyond our own thinking. And rather than it being a complement to our growth and development, it becomes a way for us to undermine our own growth and development. We're going to study a number of surah of the Quran with a specific purpose. Surah meaning chapters, or surah. Surah is the plural of surah. We're going to be studying Surah Al-Fatiha. We're going to be studying Surah Al-Ikhlas. We're going to be studying Surah Al-Alaq and Surah Al-Asr, among others. But these are the fundamentals as far as the chapters of the Quran that we will be looking at. We will be looking at Surah Al-Fatiha and Surah Al-Ikhlas because we want to understand what are the fundamentals of Islamic belief in the Quran. We will be looking at Surah Al-Alaq so we can understand ourselves, our development, and the nature of Quranic revelation and our place in the world. We will be understanding, after our study of Surah Al-Asr, the role of history and our reflection upon history and what it is that counts with regard to time, what it is that we should be focusing on in our lives. That means that our life should be purposeful. And along with that, we'll be studying the Hadith of Jibreel and the Hadith of intention from the Sunnah. We'll be studying these ahadith amongst other ahadith like the Hadith of Mu'adh bin Jabal, the Hadith that the halal is clear and the haram is clear, and the Hadith that pertains to certainty. The Hadith of Jibreel will enforce upon us how was that the Quran was revealed and how it is that Islamic education has its own characteristics in our development. It's not like any other type of education. We will be seeing how Islam is rooted in revelation. Its knowledge comes from Allah Ta'ala, and we will reflect and think about why it is the case that we believe in revelation. We will also get an understanding of how it was that the companions learned, how was that they studied, how was that the deen or the knowledge of Islam was transmitted to them. With the Hadith of intention, we will reinforce the idea of life as purposeful, that our actions should be guided by objectives. But what kind of objectives? That's a question to be asked. We see that Islam has objectives to guide our lives as a whole. Objectives which should give us certainty, objectives which are considered certain teachings in Islamic thought and knowledge. We call these objectives the maqasid of the Sharia, or the objectives of the Sharia, or the objectives of the deen. And so that set of objectives is deeply tied into the Hadith of intention, and the Hadith of intention teaches us that all of our actions, we should look at why it is that we're doing them. And once we get into that question mark of why, then we get into the whole issue of purpose and aim and objective. And then we see that Islam gives us also whys. It gives us reasons for why things are done, and it also gives us reasons for why it is that we're commanded to do things. So we have deen teaching us, and we have choices that we make. So why is deen teaching us certain things? And why should we follow it? And what is that should guide our decision making? And that's the objectives of the Sharia. They teach us that Islam holds as fundamental or key objectives, which all of Islamic teachings revolve around, such as the preservation of our values and the cultivation of our values, meaning that we shouldn't only seek to preserve our Islam, but we should also seek to make it grow. And we'll talk about that. Islam preserves life, human life, right? And it also encourages us to develop life. Islam encourages the development of our intellect and the preservation of our intellect. And this is one of the reasons why Islam prohibits alcohol and other intoxicants and other drugs which will affect our thinking ability. And it also encourages learning, and it discourages for us to digest bad ideas on a regular basis or bad images and so on and so forth, because they're destructive to us. And so we begin to think about ourselves and our own value and our own worth in light of what it is that we do. So Islam encourages the preservation and cultivation of our values, the preservation and the cultivation of life, the preservation and the cultivation of intellect, the preservation and the cultivation of human dignity. That we, should uphold the value of the human being, right? That respect is important, that we get it and that we give it. And we'll talk about that. And that life itself should be built on respect, mutual regard, and respect and upholding the human being. And we shouldn't degrade ourselves. We also have as an objective the cultivation and the preservation of the family, right? And the family serves as the foundation of the ummah. And so that's something that we have to think about. Our goals as human beings. And this is one of the reasons why Islam encourages family life and encourages marriage, because it's talking about the preservation of our dignity and the preservation of our community, and that's done within the framework of the family, right? And also Islam encourages the cultivation and the preservation of our wealth. So there's just a certain way of doing economy and making money and so on and so forth, and a certain way of working which should allow us to grow, should allow us to develop. And there's also the thinking about how it is that our wealth, when properly invested, helps us in our hereafter, and it helps us to elevate the conditions of the poor of our community. And so when we talk about the hadith of intention, we're talking about really a summary or a brief way of saying that all action should be purposeful, and that there are purposes in the deen which guide all of our actions. And we will be talking about the halal and the haram, the hadith of the halal and the haram, because the halal is that which is permissible and the haram is that which is prohibited. And what we find is that some things are obligations and clear cut, and they're permissible, of course, but then there's some things that are gray in the middle, and they're neither from the side of that which is clear cut halal and neither from the side of that which is clear cut haram. So what do we do? What do we do when things get complicated? And so we'll talk about that point. We'll talk about what are the principles of Islam, the teachings that are given to us by Islam itself to navigate those situations where things are gray. We'll talk about the Hadith of Certainty. And the Hadith of Certainty usually comes up in the discussions on Salah and, the discussions on wudu. But it's a hadith which helps us also to think about occasions in which we may question things. Does questioning by itself undermine our certainty that we have in the deen? Sometimes people get confused on that. We've heard people that they will say that because they had doubts in Islam, they're no longer Muslim. Questioning doesn't always, automatically lead to you leaving Islam. Some questioning is used as a tool. And so we will talk about questioning and talk about doubts, and we will use examples from the lives of prophets, and we will use examples from the lives of the scholars, to teach us how it is that those who are considered our models, how it is that they dealt with that type of situation. We have the example of prophets, and we have the example of scholars as well. Like the example of Ibrahim. Was Ibrahim in his questioning Allah about creation, was he really doubting Allah or doubting in the deen? Or was he asking so that he can understand better so that his certainty can grow? We'll talk about the role of certainty and the importance of certainty. And we'll talk about what to do when matters are not so clear. And so we will also cover what we call qawaid fiqhiyya, or the basic legal maxims, qawaid fiqhiyya al-kubra. And these are considered foundational legal maxims. Why? Usually they're dealt with in the area of fiqh, or the area of the knowledge of the halal and the haram, or rulings in the halal and haram. Usually there's some like axioms that guide, the knowledge of the halal and haram. But these legal maxims, what they do is they work to help us, to guide us in our thinking, right? And they help us to guide us in our action. And although we will only be dealing with 5, we will be dealing with the main 5. And the reason why is because we don't only want to get some fundamentals in teaching as found in the Quran and the Sunnah, but we also want to get some fundamentals in thinking so that we have principles to guide our thought. And those legal maxims will help us to navigate matters which are clear and unclear, and will help us to navigate issues of harm and benefit. One thing that we want to reinforce is that in this summer program, we're going to be covering issues of how it is that the Quran and the Sunnah were transmitted to us, and how it is that we understand the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And so of the knowledge that needs to be known is the knowledge of how it is that the concept of authenticity of the Quran, how it is that we understand that, and authenticity of the Sunnah. But also we want to see how it was that the companions were taught by the Prophet ﷺ to understand the Quran and the Sunnah, and how it is that they taught the tabi'een and how the tabi'een learned. And so we see a process of understanding Quran and the Sunnah that was taught from one generation to the next. So in other words, dealing with the Quran and the Sunnah is not just a personal matter of belief or interpretation. There's rules that are used that we rely upon to understand the Quran and the Sunnah, to apply them to our lives. So we understand the Quran and the Sunnah from two angles. One angle is believing in its authentic transmission, how it is that we come to believe that they are authentic and they have not been altered or changed. And the other angle is how it is that we understand the contents of the Quran and the Sunnah, the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. How is it that we know that that is what the Quran and Sunnah is saying? And so we want to look at the history and of that type of thinking that is involved in interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah and making clear its teachings. And we want to see how it is that generation after generation, the scholars dealt with that. We will be looking at the way that the Quran gives us fundamentals in learning Aqidah, and the way it is that the Quran teaches us how to deal with our own desires, and how it is that the Quran shapes our minds. And so with that said, we will be looking at the relationship of the Quran to the Sunnah and the Sunnah to the Quran, and how it is that the Quran and the Sunnah complement each other. Some people have doubt in a hadith, and they don't see how necessary, they don't believe, they don't have certainty that the Quran is necessarily understood in light of the hadith. How it is that the Sunnah, as representing the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how it is that the Sunnah clarifies. So we see the Quran in light of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Sunnah also, what it does for us is it helps us to translate the Quran, or helps us to implement the Quran into everyday life. The example of the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam will be talking about the role of seerah, or the role of the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in helping us not only to understand Islam but to practice Islam. When in doubt, we fall back on the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a guide for us, because it puts everything in its proper perspective in place. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not only chosen by Allah to teach the deen, but the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam lived the deen. The Prophet lived the deen. And in living the deen, it means here that the Prophet lived out the Quran. And because he lived out the Quran, alayhi salatu wasalam, he's teaching us how to implement the Quran. It's like studying the life of the Prophet Muhammad provides us with cliff notes, or like a study sheet that summarizes for us in a clear way what it is that we need to know in order to pass the test, so to speak. And so here we will be asking students to keep up with the classwork. And the classwork consists of participating in the class, showing up, and also keeping up with the readings, and also doing group work. The philosophy that we have of testing is that we really believe in review, not in necessarily in a grade or that you flunk or fail, but that you support each other. The testing is group oriented. And it means that you help each other, you work in groups to review what it is that you study, and you help each other to understand. There will be, some demand on you in that regard in order to be able to pass this class and to get a certificate in it, right? And so this is something that is a fun way of learning. It allows you to reinforce your friendships. It allows you to learn with others, right? So we want you to participate. We want you to keep up with the reading. We want you to participate in the groups. There's discussions that will take place as well, because it's not just the issue of the teacher just filling your mind with information, but the discussions that take place should revolve around the material that is studied. And so those discussions are set for us to be able to For us to be able to work through issues that we may confront, and for us to clarify what it is that is being taught in the class. And so we said that we're going to be dealing with a number of surahs of the Quran, or surah is properly said in the Arabic language. So, surahs of the Quran being plural of surah, but that's anglicized, or is the word turned into English. So we're going to be dealing with also a hadith. We're going to be dealing with some principles of Islamic scholarship, and they break up into legal maxims and objectives of the Sharia. That is going to be the material that we cover. Everything will be provided for you as far as the material online, right? Everything will be provided for you, so you won't have to buy anything in that regard. We ask you if there's any questions, or if there's any things that need clarification, that you go to your teacher, whether it's myself or Sheikh Umair Hasib in this session. And we ask you also to make sure that you come into the class on time. We will be opening up the class 5 minutes early or so that everyone can be present and we can start on time. And so we ask you, if there's any issues that deal with technical matters, that you refer them to us so that we have an understanding. If it be the case that you're not able to make it to a class, we ask that you let us know what's going on, because we care about you and your well-being, but we also care about you participating. If there's an issue which bothers you in the class, or someone is bothering you in the class, then please let us know so that we can deal with it. And we ask that you leave this summer program having reviewed, having made sure that you committed yourself to understanding your deen. Know your Rabb, know your deen, know your Prophet are the three fundamentals. And so these are the fundamentals that are covered in this class and in the class that follows it with Sheikh Umair Hasib. And so on that note, we will provide you the teacher's emails. We will provide you the study materials. We will give you access to the group for you to enter into the group room and for you to be able to be present. The materials will be recorded and you will be able to review them upon need. And there will be a written syllabus provided for you that will clarify some other details. But for the most part, what has been covered is what it is that we're going to be doing in this class. So once again, we're going to be covering certain surahs of the Quran. We're going to be covering certain hadith. We're going to be covering certain principles of Islamic scholarship that guide us in our thinking. We're going to be covering the history of usul, the history of fiqh, the history of the Quran, and the history of the Sunnah. And so with that, we end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.